Okay, here we are at our second video, and in this video I'm going to try to start the modeling process. So in the last video we discussed how to access a couple extra menu options within the viewport that is going to be very critical when you're modeling. They contain a lot of options and other elements that you probably are going to want to look into and learn more about as you continue to be a more proficient modeler. Today we're going to probably split this modeling process into two videos. I found that hosting sites are a little bit Nazis about size and time limits, so I may not be able to fit this all in one video. So I'm going to try to do basically two 20-minute or so videos so that I can fit them into a hosting site. So the first thing I want to do is open a new Blender scene here before we start modeling, and like I said in the last video, what I always do is I delete two elements, and that's the light source and the camera right from the get-go. Those two elements I just never end up using. And some people actually use Blender to render, and they set it up very similar to how Unity looks like. But I actually throw just all of my files back into the game and try it that way. Maybe one day when I get better, I will rig up Blender so that it has the lighting like Unity, but at this point I'm not advanced enough. If you recall in the last video, the other thing I want to do before I start anything is put my view into orthographic view. Blender will ship you out and start you out in perspective view, and in the first video I talked about how the orthographic view is just maybe a better scenario for the most part when you're modeling. There are times when you're going to want to use perspective view, but generally speaking I always start in orthographic view. And to cue this mode you hit the number pad 5, and to get back to perspective mode you hit 5 again. So very easy. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to change my scene. Right now it's in Blender units, so every one of these squares is one Blender unit, which basically refers to nothing in the real world. So what I'm going to do now is go over to our main menu, which is packs right visible from the start when you open Blender. And on the top row right here, you're going to notice there's several buttons, and these will open up and add to this tab here when you're in edit mode. But right now in object mode, you're going to just have a few options, and the biggest thing you want to look into right now is this third one over, which is the scene tab, and you want to change the view, or I'm sorry, the units of measure into metric. So now everything in Blender will now be a metric scale. I think if you actually click this scaling, and you might change this to 8, that could actually be a 1 block to 1 block ratio within cities, but I'm just not versed enough with that yet to really kind of be confident if that's what it does. So I'm going to skip that piece, but you might want to fiddle around with that later and see if that actually will make it a 1-to-1 kind of thing. Since we don't have that set up, and right now we have it set up for 1 block is 1 meter, I'm actually going to multiply everything by 8 so that we can get the correct plot size within cities. Remember, City Skylines uses a 1 meter by 1 meter block, and in Blender we have it set up right now so it's 1 meter by 1 meter. So in order to get a 4 by 4, we're going to need to make this a 32 by 32 segment, basically multiplying everything by 8 meters. The next thing I want to do after changing our scene to metric is I want to kind of go into the lines, and I want to make this so that it's easier for us to know where our limits are. So what I'm going to do is go into my viewport where my work is and hit the N as in Nancy button. And under display, like I said in the first video, we're going to change this to 32 lines. And what this means is that at the very edge of this grid, that would be a 4 by 4 plot. So as long as we don't go over this edge, we're going to know we're within a 4 by 4 plot. So there are a couple ways at moving forward here. If you wanted to scale this cube to begin modeling and to start getting this thing kind of building size, right now the default cube always sets up at 2 meters by 2 meters. So we're basically a very tiny little item right now. If we loaded this into the game, we would have, I don't know, maybe a very tiny small little object. You'd have to zoom in big time to see. So right now what we'd like to do is scale this default cube so we can kind of start working with it as a building. I can go into edit mode and I can select everything by hitting A and hit the S button to scale, and I can do this freehand. But when we're first starting out, there's an easier way at doing this. As long as I know kind of what my dimensions will be, I can stay in object mode, and under your main menu tab, under the transform, or I'm sorry, not the main menu, but the N as in Nancy menu, you'll notice the transform button will have a section called dimensions. And if we actually change these dimensions right here in object mode, it will actually change our cube dimensions to a specific number that we choose. So I know that I want to make basically no bigger than a 2x4 building. I know we kept talking about 4x4, but I don't think there's a way to make this a 2x4. So we're going to keep it at 4x4, but just make sure that our dimensions would equate to a 2x4. So if you can recall in the first episode, anything underneath this grid below our X line, this red X line, is going to be below ground. So one of the things we want to do is eventually move this building up, but we actually want to make it somewhat 2x4. So in order to do this, I'm going to go over to my X coordinate. Actually, the first thing I want to do is I want to be in the front of my building. And so we want to hit 1, and now we're in the front of our building, so we know this is the front, just so that we're sure at what it looks like. And I'm going to go back over to our menu bar to the dimensions. I'm going to hit 16 for 16 meters, and now we have a 16 meter wide building. And let's say we want this to be, I don't know, let's say 2 stories, and each story we can make it in this industrial building around 5 feet, just to be simple with this. Maybe if you wanted to be more realistic, you could do 3.5 and do a little more math to figure everything out. But for this example, we're going to keep it simple, and we want the height of the building to be 5 feet, and for each floor. So we want I'm going to make a two-story building. So we're going to have a default height of 10 per floor. But I'm going to add 5 meters in so that we can add some extra decor and some spacers in between the floors here. So a total height we're going to put down is 15. And I'm sorry, we want to be in the Z coordinate because that is our height, not the Y coordinate. So now that we're in 15 meters, we notice that the cube now is 15. And for the Y coordinate, we definitely want this to be, this is back and front basically. So we want this to be a 4 units in game. So this is going to be a 32 dimension. 32 meters long, 16 meters wide, and then 15 meters high. And if we actually pan over, we can now see that that's what happened. And you notice that our entire mesh goes to the very edge of this grid. So we know that it's a 32 meter building. So now the next thing we want to do is half of our building is now currently underground. As you can see by this red line as our ground demarcation, everything below this is going to be underground. So we want to raise this entire mesh up. So I'm going to select this mesh, hit tab to get into object mode, and notice how when you first select an isolated mesh, when there's only one thing here, everything gets selected. So I don't need to reselect everything. I'm going to hit the 1 button so I get into front view, and I'm going to use a very important tool called snapping. And to turn on snapping, you hit shift and hit the tab button. And you can see this turned on down here at the bottom of your screen, or close to the bottom of the screen, with your magnet kind of highlighted right here. And so once the magnet is highlighted, you can actually change the way that this snaps. And notice that you can snap in different ways. You can snap to edges of meshes, you can snap to vertex of meshes. But what we're going to do is stay in the increment so that we can actually use these grid lines and stay very even and very accurate with where this mesh goes on this screen. So now that we're in edit mode, now that we have the whole mesh selected, we're going to hit our go or grab key by hitting the G on the keyboard. And then right after that, I'm going to hit Z because I want it to go only up and down. So by hitting G first and Z directly after that, I just told Blender that I don't want it to move in any other direction other than up and down. So it doesn't matter how I move my mouse. My only motion that Blender will move this cube is up and down. Now I'm going to hit escape to get back to and cancel that action. I'm going to do G and then X. And if you notice how if I do that, I can only move it on the X axis. Again, this is an extremely critical technique when you're modeling so that you can keep everything accurate. So going back to our initial command, G and then Z, I'm going to go ahead and move this up with my mouse so that it's even with the horizon. If you notice now that I've got a little gap here, it wasn't exactly, for whatever reason, we're not exactly snapping to these grid lines. So an easy way to do this is Blender allows you to actually be a little more precise and hit the shift key while you're moving something, and that will actually move in increments smaller than the original increment. So if I hit G and then Z again to move only on the only on the Z axis, and then hold shift while I move this down, I'm actually going to subdivide those increments into something smaller. So now I can get it exactly on that horizon. And if you notice, we zoom in here, it is exactly on the horizon. Okay? So now we have kind of the base of our building. We have it directly on the horizon, so it's not underground, and we basically have the right dimensions of the bare box of this building, the space that we want it to occupy. Now, in this situation, what I'm going to do is, this is going to be our LOD, our LOD, or level of detail. And a lot of people do the LOD differently. And there's not a right way or wrong way, as long as you keep to the basic tenets of what the LOD, or the level of detail, is, which is a very extremely low poly, far away viewed of your asset, so that basically it renders at a lower file sizes than all of your other meshes. The details don't need to be there on the level of detail. That's the name of level of detail, because you are zooming in on a far away object. If we were to look at this in game, you wouldn't be able to tell half the details we're going to add into it modeling. So the LOD needs to be a very simple structure that eventually will be UV wrapped, and the game can auto texture. Now, if you have a complex building, you're going to want to make your own texture. But for a simple building like this, we're going to allow the game baker to bake out the texture based on the UV unwrapping that we've done. That is moving far ahead. But what I'd like to do now is I'm going to actually save this simple box just how it is as a new Blender file. And we're going to come back to that in a later video. So we're going to save this as, I'm going to go down to my desktop, and I'm going to save this as tutorial LOD model. And we'll save that. And now we have our LOD kind of pre-done, ready to go. And we'll add to the LOD a little bit, but this is kind of, for this building, this basically might be all we really need for the LOD. Okay, so let's get to the meat and bones. Let's start modeling. Let's start getting into some tools, and let's do some stuff with this mesh here so that we can actually make a building. So like I said, the first thing we want to do is let's start cutting out floors. Let's make some guidelines on where we want this, how this mesh to look. So I'm going to go into front view, and if you recall, we basically have this building at a 15-meter height, and every single block here is 5 meters. So if you recall, we wanted our first building height to be about 5 meters. So I'm going to count up 5 blocks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oops, I think I counted one too much. And the first tool I'm going to show you is the loop cut tool. And to access the loop cut tool while you're in edit mode, which I haven't been in yet, I just click tab to get into edit mode. So now we have vertexes and everything manipulatable. And the loop cut tool will basically make a line or a new cut around this mesh so that you can manipulate it. And it'll make more sense when I do it. So we're going to count up about 5 units so we kind of know where about we want to make our first floor. And I'm going to hover over our mesh and hold control and hit the R as in Romeo button. And once you do that, your loop cut tool is engaged, but you're going to notice it doesn't see anything. You have to kind of get and move your mouse close to an edge. And when you move your mouse close to an edge, you're going to see that pink line show up, and that means that the loop cut tool is engaged. And you basically want to move it so that you can make a horizontal cut or a vertical cut. And once you figure out what you want to do, you click it. And once you click it once and only once, then you can actually move this loop cut up and down depending on where you want it. Now notice that it's snapping. I still have snapping on, and it's not snapping to my lines directly. So I'm going to hold shift and scroll this up so that it snaps directly to where I want it to. Boom. And now we're at the 5 unit mark. 2, 4, 5. So this floor is now 5 units high. And if you look all around our mesh, that loop cut tool just made a complete cut all around. Alright, so we're going to do the same thing for the next floor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But an important feature that I want to make is that I'm going to make slight little accents to kind of separate these floors. I'm actually going to make extra loop cuts here so that we can plan for those later. What I want to make a loop cut is about a half a meter, which would be about 1 foot or so, 1.5 feet or so. And so what I'm going to do is basically use another tool. Actually, you know, I'm going to use the loop cut tool again, and I'm going to again do the same kind of setup that we did. Control R, move over to a line where I want it horizontal or I want it vertical. Click it once, and then move this back down to about where I want it. And then once it starts to not snap how I want it, I'm going to hold the shift key and kind of get it to where I want it to go. And for this one, I don't need it to be exact, but I want it to be somewhat close. So we're going to go, actually we'll go a meter, we'll go a full meter here, and we'll just click it right about here. And so we're going to do the same thing for the first floor. We're going to count 5 again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Control R to loop cut. Click once, hold shift to get it fine tuned, and we're going to loop cut the second floor right here. And we're going to do the same thing, make another barrier or another little accent piece by holding control, hit R again, do another loop cut. Click where you want it, and then kind of place it by holding shift and making sure that it's exact. Alright, so now that we've got this, these portions are going to be kind of blocks or little barriers in between our floors here. Now this section up here could be kind of an attic or something, and so what I want to do is actually make another one of these lips on the very tip top so it kind of separates that. Now we can also put in between here maybe a sign or some other things, but that's kind of the cool thing about modeling, is you can take all this creative license and kind of make these buildings however you want. Even if you're trying to model it off of a real life building, it could still be somewhat close. Okay, so now I've got this tip top piece, so this is going to be another piece that we're going to break up. And actually I'm going to make one more loop cut because I want it to be something a little skinnier. So we're going to do something like this. And again, it's hard to tell right now what we're going to do because you can see all the lines, but these are just place markers so that we can figure out how we want to do this mesh a bit later. Alright, so the next thing I want to do is I think I'm going to pull these pieces out so that we actually kind of look like it's something that's an accent or a piece of the wall that's supposed to break up the floors. So to do that, I'm going to go down here to the tool select portion and click on the face button. And after clicking my face button, I'm actually going to right click on these faces in order to select one at a time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an extrude tool. Now extrude tool basically pulls this face out and creates geometry on top of that so that we can pull these pieces out. Now extrude tool is a very good and very useful tool on so many different aspects of modeling, but you kind of always have to think about, is that the right tool for the job, or is that what you want this to do? By extruding this, I'm going to create extra geometry and extra tries and make my model a lot bigger than it may need to be. So kind of think about these elements when you're modeling. Do I need to really extrude this, or do I need to make this actual geometry? There are times where you want to add detail and you're going to need to add extra pieces, but there are times where you're going to want to texture and actually use other methods so that you're not wasting tries, burning tries on stuff that just aren't really part of a very focused part of your building. So after selecting a face and making sure that we're in face select mode down here, I'm going to right click this face. I'm going to hit E for extrude. And if you notice right away, without doing anything else, we get a purple line or blue line that comes up. That will always be perpendicular to the face that we selected. Now I can actually click on my number pad now and select or type in an actual dimension for this extruding. I want to extrude this out maybe 0.3. Not very far. It's just a small little lip so that you can kind of see a small little shadow or something else to break this apart. And I'm going to go around and do this across the entire face of these little chunks right here. And we're going to just do E for extrude and type in 0.3. E for extrude, 0.3. I'm going to do the same thing up here. And just work your way across the model, E for extrude, type in 0.3, and then hit enter. Okay, now we've got this entire thing extruded. So now what we've done is we've created kind of these little lips. So now we've got kind of a non-boring box. There is a little bit of a difference, there is a little bit of shadowing, and there is some stuff going on here. One thing I don't like is these corners. So what I'm going to do is actually fill these corners and create new geometry. The way to do this, one way to do this is by going down to your line or vertex select. And at first I'm going to use the line select mode. And realize that you're going to have to use these tools constantly in different ways and in different strategies. But a cool thing with the line and vertex tool is that if you select two lines and click F as in Frank to fill, it will actually fill your two selections with geometry. So it's actually filled the face here. And if I actually click these three lines and do the same thing, it will fill the face. In order for me to see the bottom piece, this part on the bottom, without having to select into or move my camera, I'm actually use a thing called wireframe mode, which I briefly showed you in the first video. By hitting Z as in zebra, I can now see through this model and select all of my faces here without having to actually move my camera. And now I actually have those filled. And we're going to go ahead and do this across the entire model on all of these corners. Fill all of these little chunks here, and just move your way across. And unfortunately, there's not really good ways in the modeling process at procedurally doing these things. So you're going to hear me do a lot of filler talk right now while I'm going through this, but this is part of the modeling process, which I've frequently asked myself, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? I'm sitting here clicking thousands of lines, trying to fill this random face, and it's the 21st century. Why don't we have things that do this? So just realize when you get to sometimes and some points of your modeling process, unfortunately, this is kind of what a lot of modelers deal with. Very tedious, meticulous, and detailed stuff like this. Okay, last edge or last corner here, and we'll be able to move on to these black segments that you're seeing appear now. Notice how the black segments are appearing when we've created that new geometry, and everything else is a gray. What the black segments mean is that our normals are flipped. And if you don't know what the normals are, or what normals are, I cannot explain this in this video, so I suggest you go ahead and do some research. Basically, a normal is how light flips off of a face or a vertex, and if light is not bouncing off of this, the game is telling it by physics it's see-through. There's no light bouncing off of this, that's why it's black. And an easy way to tell this is if you actually go over to your Nancy menu or your N menu while you're in edit mode and you have a face selected, you can actually go scroll down to the mesh display section right here. And if you click normals, you can click face normals, line normals, or vertex normals. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to click face normals. I'm going to expand this so that you can see the lines better. So in a normal, the light should go perpendicular basically to these faces, as you can see here. But in these faces, nothing is actually pulling up. So these are flipped. So what we want to do is click these faces by normally clicking it, hit W as in Wilco, and flip normal. Okay, and now we've got a proper looking normal. And I think these top are also not flipped correctly. So we're going to do that for all of those. Make sure that all of these are flipped normally. Okay, so this one, I don't know what happened here if I flipped that normal or not correctly. That looks like it should be okay. Yes, so notice how once we flip these normals, they stop being black, like over here. You can kind of see that they're shaded correctly. Okay, so we'll go here, do that one, and just go scroll around and do all of these black black chunks. And you never want to see these black faces or black lines in your mesh. That means that you're going to see-through parts of your mesh, and this is not good. Another element of modeling is making sure you're very detail oriented and stopping every now and then and double, triple, quadruple checking your work. It's a lot easier to just model things correctly than to fuck it up and go back later to try to fix it. Okay, so you can see these are dark, but that's just the shading right now that's kind of playing into it in Blender, but we don't have black faces anymore, which is what we want. Okie dokie. So now we've got this set up, and we've got kind of these basic borders here, and that's kind of what I wanted. I didn't want this building to be a flat building. So what I'm going to do is actually go back here to these top portions, and I want to extend these a little further out than these ones. So these are going to go out 0.5, but I'm going to extrude these 0.5 and do the exact same thing I just did with the lower ones. Okay, so we're going to go and again the tedious process of selecting these and going through and doing this again. And my normals are starting to get in the way, so I'm going to click that off, and instead of actually waiting to do this all at once, I'm going to go and flip these normals as I'm going through it. So you won't see me go back and unflip these normals. I'm just going to do them as I'm at the actual spot. So just remember that if you're following along trying to do this later. that I will be going through and flipping these normals right away. And again, I know I said this earlier, but I'm a very newbie at this, guys. I'm a novice, man. I suck at this shit. So there's probably a lot of easier ways to do a lot of these things, or other ways of doing these things that I don't know about. So if you know those things, leave me a comment or send me a message and let me know, because I would love to know. But then I'm going to go ahead and do these things the way I know how to do them, and even if that means it's the long way or the inefficient way. Okay, so now we've got that top portion done. Now we've kind of starting to get a building set up. You can kind of see Blender's already rendering some shadowing and some things now that's making our building look a little more interesting. From a distance, it kind of almost is starting to look like a building here, so that's a good sign. Alright, and so the last thing I think I'm going to do for this portion is I'm going to inset the roof so that we can actually have a workable roof. And so what I'd like to do here is I'm going to actually go to the top view by hitting 7. And I'm going to use Shift and the middle mouse button to pan down just a little bit so we're centered in the camera viewport. And after selecting this face, now remember, you want to make sure only this face is selected. So hit wireframe mode or scroll around your model and make sure nothing else is selected. You can also hit A to deselect everything while something is selected, and then re-click it to make sure it's the only thing. But hitting 7 to go back in the top view, I'm going to do something called Inset Faces. And on the left toolbar under the tools, and about midway through, you're going to see Inset Face. So I'm going to click this button, and I'm going to actually inset this just a little bit. Maybe that's good enough, I think. Actually, I didn't do anything. Let's undo that, and let's inset face just a little bit, because what we're going to do here is make this the roof. And we just want a small little lip around this edge so that it's like a ledge to the roof. The next thing we want to do is, since we've now inset this face, is we're going to drop this entire piece down by hitting extrude. And notice how it is perpendicular going up and down the Z perfectly. So we're just going to drop this one space down, one unit. And we've simply made a rooftop. It's very easy, just like that. So now we've got kind of an indentation on the top for a roof, and we're good to go. This is kind of a good start to this building. So what I'd like to do, since we're at the 27 point mark here, is I'm going to go ahead and end this phase, and we'll continue on with the rest of this building later. And just to be sure that everything is good, we're going to go through again and make sure our normals are all facing the right way. Sometimes I'll even flip them back again to make sure that it's pointing the right way. Triple checking before I save this, before we move on. Okay, now the last thing I want to do is talk about smooth shading real quick, because smooth shading and shading groups are extremely important. Do your own research on this, but basically what these will do is, without actually having to add a very smooth or high geometry or high vertex and line and poly count item, you can actually make the Blender shader shade something so that it looks smoother than it really is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take all of these faces moving around the front of these little accents, and I'm going to smooth shade them so you can kind of see what that does. And what it will do is, instead of giving us a very flat blocky look on these pieces, it will actually smooth out and make them a little more rounder. We can add bevels and add extra geometry to make this work a little better, but you'll see what I'm talking about. So we're going to smooth the faces. Let's smooth the edges and vertices, might as well all at the same time. I don't know what that will do, but let's see here. Cool. So what we've done now is we kind of made like this smooth front, and the flat and the top is kind of flat. And I guess that's kind of what I want to see anyway. I kind of want to see this to be kind of like a rounded front, and the tops are kind of flat. So you can see instantly what smooth shading can do to really help your model look kind of polished. So you may not like the overall look of this, but I kind of like how that looks. When we texture and add some details, it'll look a little better. So at this point, I think I'm going to go ahead and end here. And again, we talked about the modeling, a couple of the basic tools like extrude, grab, rotate. I actually didn't touch on rotate yet. And some normals. So in the next video, we'll continue on with the modeling process, and then we'll probably end up start the UV or UV exportation, how you export UV layouts to texture. and then we'll do another video for texturing. So anyway, stay tuned. Thanks for watching.